I didn't know the moment my life changed was the one where no one else stopped to look. The hospital doors slid shut behind me with a soft hiss, too gentle for the weight they carried, like they were sealing something final, something I couldn't undo, and I stood there in the cold night air with Noah in my arms, his small body burning against mine, his cheek pressed into my shoulder, his breath uneven, too fast, too shallow, and I whispered his name like it could anchor him, like it could anchor me. "It's okay, baby, I've got you," even though my hands wouldn't stop shaking and my voice cracked halfway through the lie, and the nurse's words kept echoing in my head: insurance, payment, policy, words that sounded clean and professional but felt like doors slamming in slow motion, one after another, until there was nowhere left to go, and I stepped off the curb into the parking lot without really seeing where I was going, the streetlights blurring through the tears I didn't remember letting fall. Everything reduced to the weight of him in my arms and the fear that kept tightening in my chest like a fist I couldn't pry open, and I remember thinking how quiet it was, how the world didn't pause, didn't notice, cars passing, headlights sweeping across wet pavement, people moving in and out of their own lives while mine felt like it was unraveling right there under those flickering lights. And then Noah stirred, a small sound, barely there, but it cut through everything, and I dropped to my knees on the cold concrete without thinking, holding him closer, pressing my cheek to his hair, breathing him in like I could somehow keep him here just by not letting go. And that's when I started crying, not loud, not dramatic, just this silent, shaking kind of breaking that came from somewhere too deep to control, because I didn't know what to do next. I didn't have a plan, I didn't have anyone to call, and for a second, just 1 second, I felt completely invisible, like I could disappear right there and nothing would change, and I didn't know that somewhere behind the line of parked cars, behind tinted glass and quiet engines, someone was watching, not the way people usually look, not curious or passing or indifferent, but focused, still, like he had all the time in the world to decide what to do with what he was seeing. And I didn't know that my worst moment had just become someone else's decision point, because to me, it was just another night, another failure, another door closing, and I stayed there longer than I should have, long enough for the cold to seep through my jeans, long enough for my fingers to go numb where they held Noah's back, long enough that when I finally stood again, I felt heavier, like something inside me had shifted and settled into place, something tired, something done, and I turned toward the street, not knowing where I was going, just knowing I had to move, had to keep going because stopping felt too much like giving up, and I took one step, then another, adjusting Noah against my shoulder, whispering to him again even though I wasn't sure he could hear me, and I didn't see the black car at the edge of the lot, didn't notice the engine idling, didn't notice the way it didn't drive away, because I wasn't looking for anyone anymore. I had already learned what happens when you ask for help and no one answers, and I didn't know that someone had just decided that answer was no longer acceptable. I made it halfway to the bus stop before my legs started to give out, not in some dramatic collapse but in that slow, quiet way where each step feels heavier than the last, like the ground is pulling you down instead of holding you up, and Noah shifted in my arms again, a small whimper escaping his lips, his fingers clutching weakly at my jacket, and I tightened my hold on him, adjusting his weight even though my shoulders ached and my back screamed in protest, because putting him down was not an option, not tonight, not ever, and I kept walking because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant realizing just how close I was to having nothing left to try, and the street stretched ahead of me under dim lights, empty in that late night way where everything feels suspended, like the world is holding its breath, and I remember wondering how far I could go like this, how long before I had to make another impossible decision, and that was when I heard it, not loud, not sudden, just the soft roll of tires moving slowly behind me, matching my pace in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise, and I told myself not to look, not to assume, not to panic, because panic had not helped me inside that hospital and it would not help me now, but the sound stayed with me, steady, deliberate, and after a few more steps I could not ignore it anymore, so I turned my head just slightly, enough to catch the reflection in a dark storefront window, and I saw it there, a black car moving at a crawl, headlights low, engine quiet, too quiet, and something about it felt intentional, like it was not just passing by but choosing to stay, and my grip on Noah tightened instinctively as I picked up my pace, even though my body protested, even though I knew I could not outrun anything in the state I was in. And then the car slowed even more before finally coming to a stop a few yards ahead of me, angled just enough to block part of the sidewalk, and my heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my ears, drowning out everything else, and the driver's side door opened with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the silence, and I froze, not because I wanted to but because my body refused to move, caught somewhere between fear and exhaustion, and a man stepped out, tall, composed, dressed in a way that did not belong on this street at this hour. Everything about him controlled, measured, like he existed in a different world entirely, and for a second he did not say anything, he just looked at me, not past me, not through me, but at me, like he had already decided I mattered and was simply confirming it, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself to find my voice even though it came out thin and unsteady. I do not have anything, I said. Because that was what you said in situations like this, that was what you learned, to make yourself small. To make yourself uninteresting, to hope that whoever was in front of you would decide you were not worth the trouble, but his expression did not change, not even a flicker, and his eyes moved briefly to Noah before returning to my face, sharp, assessing, and then he spoke, his voice low, calm, carrying none of the urgency that was tearing through me. He needs a doctor, he said, like it was a simple fact, like it was something already decided, and I shook my head immediately, stepping back without thinking. We were just there, I replied, the words coming faster now. Defensive, automatic, they cannot help us, and something shifted in his gaze at that, not anger, not surprise, something colder, more focused, like a calculation had just changed, and he took one step closer, not enough to invade my space but enough to make it clear he was not leaving, and I felt the balance of the moment tilt in a way I could not control, like the night itself had paused to see what I would do next, and he spoke again, softer this time, but with a weight that pressed against my chest. That was before I saw you, he said. And I did not understand what that meant, not yet, but something in the way he said it made my breath catch, because it did not sound like an offer, it sounded like a decision. I should have said no, I should have turned and walked away like I had done 100 times before when something felt off, when something felt too easy, too convenient, because nothing in my life had ever come without a cost. But Noah shifted in my arms again and let out a soft, broken sound that cut straight through every instinct telling me to run, and I looked down at his face, flushed and pale at the same time, his lashes damp against his cheeks, and my chest tightened so hard it almost hurt to breathe. And suddenly this was not about fear anymore, it was about him, it had always been about him, and I realized I was standing there hesitating while he needed help I could not give, and that thought alone made my decision for me, even if I did not trust the man in front of me, even if everything about him felt like a world I did not belong in. So I swallowed the fear and forced the words out. I cannot pay you, I said quietly. Because that mattered, because there was always a price, and I needed him to understand that I had nothing left to offer, not money, not anything. But he did not react the way I expected. There was no frustration, no impatience, just that same steady look that made it feel like he had already moved past that concern entirely, like it was irrelevant to whatever decision he had made. And he reached for the back door of the car and opened it without breaking eye contact, a simple motion. Controlled, precise, and for a second the world narrowed down to that open door, to the choice sitting right in front of me, and I hesitated again, my feet rooted to the ground, my mind racing through every possible outcome, every warning I had ever learned, every story I had ever heard. But then Noah's hand tightened weakly against my jacket and that was it, that was all it took, and I stepped forward, moving carefully, like the moment might shatter if I moved too fast, and I slid into the back seat, pulling him closer to me as I settled against the leather that felt too smooth, too expensive, too far removed from anything I was used to, and the door closed softly behind me, sealing me into a space that felt quiet in a way I had never experienced before, not empty, not cold, just controlled, like even the air inside this car followed rules I did not understand. And the man walked around to the driver's side and got in without a word, the engine humming to life almost silently as the car began to move, smooth and steady, like the chaos of the last hour had never happened, and I sat there gripping Noah, my eyes fixed on the back of the seat in front of me because looking anywhere else felt too risky, too revealing, and after a few moments I heard his voice again, calm, measured. "What is his name?" he asked, and I hesitated before answering, not because the question was difficult but because something about it felt important, like it mattered more than it should have. "Noah," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, and there was a brief pause before he spoke again, softer this time, almost thoughtful. "Noah," he repeated, like he was committing it to memory, and I felt something shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, and I did not understand it, not yet, but I felt it, and I realized in that moment that whatever was happening, whatever path I had just stepped onto, it was not temporary, it was something deliberate, something chosen, and for the first time that night, my fear was not the only thing I felt, there was something else there too, something unfamiliar, something I could not quite name, but it made my grip on Noah tighten. Just a little more, because deep down, in a place I was not ready to admit out loud, I knew this was not just help, this was the beginning of something that would change everything. I did not realize how far we had driven until the city started to change, the familiar cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights giving way to cleaner roads, quieter intersections, buildings that looked untouched by the kind of life I was used to, and I sat there in the back seat holding Noah, watching the world shift outside the window like I had crossed into something I was not supposed to see, something that did not belong to me, and the car never slowed, never hesitated, moving with a purpose that made me feel like this destination had already been decided long before I stepped inside, and I tried to keep track of where we were going, counting turns, memorizing street signs, but it all blurred together after a while, my focus slipping every time Noah stirred, every time his breath hitched just slightly in a way that made my chest tighten again, and I leaned my head down close to his, whispering to him under my breath, soft reassurances I was not even sure he could hear, just needing to say them out loud so I did not feel so helpless, and eventually the car slowed, turning into a wide entrance framed by tall iron gates that opened without the driver saying a word, like someone had been waiting, like someone had been watching, and that thought sent a quiet chill down my spine, not sharp or sudden, just there, settling in the background of everything else I was trying to process, and we pulled up in front of a building that looked more like a private clinic than anything else, clean lines, soft lighting, everything calm and controlled in a way that felt almost unreal after the chaos of the night, and before I could even ask a question, the door beside me opened, not by him but by someone else, a woman in scrubs who moved quickly but not hurried, her eyes going straight to Noah with a focus that made me instinctively step forward, like my body trusted her before my mind could catch up, and I hesitated only for a second before stepping out of the car, my legs unsteady but moving, driven by something stronger than fear, and she spoke gently, her voice steady. "We have him," she said, and I froze at that, not because of the words but because of how easily she said them, like it was already decided, like there was no question of whether help would be given or not, and I tightened my hold on Noah instinctively, my arms resisting even as I knew I could not do what needed to be done on my own, and I looked past her, searching for him, needing to understand what was happening, needing some kind of explanation, and he was there, standing a few feet away, watching, not interfering, not rushing, just present in a way that made it feel like everything around us was moving according to his will without him needing to say anything, and our eyes met for a brief moment, and I realized something that made my breath catch. He was not asking for my trust, he was expecting it, not in an arrogant way, not loud or forceful, just certain, like he had already removed every other option, and I looked back down at Noah, at the way his small body felt too warm, too fragile in my arms, and my resistance broke in a quiet, almost invisible way, and I nodded once, more to myself than anyone else, before carefully letting the woman take him from me, my hands lingering for a second longer than necessary, like I needed to be sure he would not disappear the moment I let go. And when she turned and moved quickly toward the entrance, I felt the emptiness in my arms immediately, sharp and disorienting, like I had lost something essential, and I took a step forward without thinking, ready to follow, but his voice stopped me, calm and steady behind me. "They will take care of him," he said, and I turned back slowly, my heart still racing, my thoughts scattered, and for the first time since this night began, I asked the question that had been building in the back of my mind, the one I could not ignore anymore. "Why are you doing this?" I said, my voice quieter now, more fragile than I wanted it to be, and he held my gaze for a moment, his expression unreadable but not distant, not cold, just controlled, and when he finally answered, it was simple, almost too simple, "Because I saw you," he said, and something about the way he said it made the world feel different again, like that moment outside the hospital had not been random at all, like it had been the beginning of something I was only just starting to understand. The moment they disappeared through those glass doors, everything inside me went with them, and I stood there for a second longer than I should have, staring at the entrance like I could still see Noah through it, like if I focused hard enough I could follow every step they were taking, every movement, every breath, and my arms felt wrong without him, too light, too empty, like I had forgotten something important and could not figure out what it was. and I wrapped them around myself without thinking, pressing my hands against my sleeves as if that could replace the warmth I had just lost, and the silence around me felt different now, heavier somehow, because there was nothing left to distract me from what was happening, nothing left to hold on to except the awareness that I had just handed my child over to people I did not know in a place I had never been, all because of a man whose name I did not even have. And that realization hit me all at once, sharp and undeniable, and I turned back to him, my heartbeat picking up again, not from panic this time but from something closer to urgency. "I need to be with him," I said, the words coming out steadier than I felt, and he did not hesitate, did not argue, just gave a small nod and gestured toward the entrance, like that had always been part of the plan, and I moved immediately, my steps faster now, driven by the need to close the distance between me and Noah, to make sure he was still there, still okay, and the doors opened before I reached them, the same quiet efficiency as everything else here, and inside, the air felt warmer, calmer, like the outside world had been left behind completely, and I followed the path the woman had taken, guided more by instinct than direction, until I saw them again, a room at the end of the hall, soft lights, machines humming quietly in the background, and Noah lying on a bed that looked too big for him, surrounded by people who moved with purpose but without panic, their voices low, controlled, and I stopped just outside the doorway, afraid to step in, afraid to break whatever fragile stability they had created around him, and one of the nurses glanced up, meeting my eyes with a brief, reassuring look that made something in my chest loosen just slightly, not enough to relax, not enough to trust completely, but enough to breathe, and I stayed there, watching, counting each rise and fall of his chest, each small movement, anchoring myself to the rhythm of it, because as long as he was breathing, everything else could wait, everything else could be figured out later, and I did not notice him step up beside me until I felt his presence, not close enough to crowd me, just there, steady, like he had been standing there all along, and I did not look at him right away, my focus still locked on Noah. But I spoke anyway, my voice quieter now, more honest than before. "If something happens to him," I started, the words catching slightly before I could finish them, and I forced myself to continue, "I will not survive that," and there was a brief pause after that, not uncomfortable, not tense, just a space where my words settled between us, and when he finally responded, his voice was lower than before, more deliberate, like he understood the weight of what I had said. "Nothing is going to happen to him," he said, not as reassurance, not as comfort, but as something stronger, something absolute, and I turned to look at him then, really look at him for the first time since this began, and I realized that he was not trying to convince me, he was stating a fact, and something about that made my breath catch again, because it felt like he was not just hoping for a good outcome, he was ensuring it, like whatever power he held extended into this room, into this moment, into my life in a way I had not fully understood until now, and I looked back at Noah, my fingers curling slightly at my sides, and for the first time that night, the fear inside me shifted, not gone, not even close, but no longer the only thing I felt, because somewhere beneath it, something else was beginning to form, something unfamiliar, something dangerous in its own way, and I did not know yet whether it was relief or the beginning of trust, but I knew one thing for certain, this was no longer a situation I could walk away from, because the moment he saw me, everything changed, and I was only just starting to see how much. Time started to blur after that, not in a dramatic way but in slow, uneven pieces, like my mind could not keep up with everything happening around me, and I stayed there by the doorway longer than I realized, watching every small movement, every adjustment the nurses made, every quiet exchange between them, trying to understand what they were doing without asking, because asking felt like admitting I did not belong there, and I was not ready to hear that out loud, and at some point someone gently guided me to a chair just inside the room, close enough that I could still see Noah clearly, close enough that I could reach him if I needed to, and I sat down without resisting, my body finally catching up to the exhaustion I had been ignoring, my hands resting in my lap but never still, fingers twisting together, pulling at the edge of my sleeve, anything to release the tension that had nowhere else to go, and I kept my eyes on him, counting again, breath after breath, like it was the only thing holding everything together, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rhythm began to change, not drastically, not all at once, just enough that I noticed, just enough that something inside me eased by a fraction, and one of the nurses adjusted something near his bed before stepping back, giving me a small nod that felt more meaningful than any words could have been, and I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, my shoulders dropping slightly as the tightness in my chest loosened just enough to let air in without resistance, and I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my gaze still fixed on him, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was going to be okay. And that thought alone made everything else feel distant for a moment, like the fear had stepped back just far enough for something else to take its place, something quieter, something fragile, and I closed my eyes briefly, just for a second, letting that feeling settle before it could disappear, and when I opened them again, he was still there, still breathing, still fighting in his own quiet way, and I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not fully, but something close to it, something I had not felt in hours, and I straightened slightly in my seat, my attention sharpening again, because now that there was hope, even a small amount of it, losing it felt even more unbearable, and I became aware of him again, standing just outside the room, not intruding, not interrupting, just present in that same controlled way, and I realized that he had not left, not once, not even for a moment, and that realization settled into my mind slowly, piece by piece, because people did not usually stay, not without a reason, not without expecting something in return, and I turned my head slightly, studying him more carefully this time, noticing the details I had missed before, the way he carried himself, the way everything around him seemed to adjust without him asking, the quiet authority that did not need to be announced, and I felt that same question rising again, stronger now, more insistent, because none of this made sense, not the clinic, not the immediate care, not the way everything had shifted so quickly from rejection to control, and I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady but holding, and stepped toward the doorway, toward him, needing answers even if I was not sure I was ready to hear them, and when I reached him, I kept my voice low, not wanting to disturb the fragile calm behind me. "This is not normal," I said, the words coming out more certain than I felt. "People do not just step in like this," and he looked at me for a moment, his expression unchanged but his attention focused entirely on me now, and there was a pause, not uncomfortable, just measured, like he was deciding how much to say. And then he answered, his voice calm, steady, carrying that same quiet certainty that had been there from the beginning. "You are right," he said, and I felt my breath catch slightly, waiting for what came next, and he held my gaze for a second longer before continuing, "They do not," and there was something in the way he said it that made my chest tighten again, not from fear this time but from the weight of what it implied, because if this was not normal, if this was not something he did for everyone, then it meant something else entirely, something deliberate, something chosen. And I realized in that moment that I was not just someone he had helped, I was someone he had decided to help, and that difference felt larger than anything I had faced so far, because it meant this was not random, it meant this was personal in a way I did not yet understand, and I turned back toward Noah, my heart steadying in a new rhythm, because whatever this was, whatever had started the moment he saw me, it was still unfolding, and I was already too far inside it to turn back now. It must have been an hour, maybe more, but time had stopped behaving normally, stretching in some places and disappearing in others, and I stayed close to Noah the entire time, moving only when the nurses needed space, my eyes tracking every detail like I could memorize his recovery into existence, and eventually one of the doctors stepped forward, speaking quietly, explaining things in terms I barely processed except for the part that mattered. That he was stabilizing, that his body was responding, that we had made it here in time, and those words echoed in my mind long after he stepped away, repeating over and over until they began to feel real, until they settled into something I could hold on to, and I found myself nodding even after there was no one left to nod to, like I was agreeing with the moment itself, like I was trying to lock it in place so it could not change, and when I finally reached out and brushed my fingers gently against Noah's hand, it felt different this time, not just warm but steady, present, and my throat tightened as I let out a breath that trembled more than I expected, because the fear that had been holding me together was beginning to loosen, and without it, I did not know what to do with myself, and I stayed there like that for a while, just existing in that fragile space between relief and disbelief, until a nurse approached me again, her voice soft but certain. "He is going to need to rest," she said, and I nodded, even though every instinct in me wanted to stay right where I was, wanted to keep watching, keep holding on, but I knew she was right, and slowly, reluctantly, I stepped back, my gaze lingering on him for as long as possible before I finally turned away. And the moment I did, the exhaustion hit me all at once, not gradually, not gently, but like something I had been holding back finally caught up to me, and my legs felt heavier than before, my thoughts slower, everything inside me running on whatever strength I had left, and I made my way out into the hallway, each step quieter than the last, until I reached the same spot where he had been standing before, and he was still there, exactly where I had left him, like time had not touched him at all, like he had been waiting without needing to move, and I stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to put into words everything that had just happened, because none of it made sense in the world I came from, none of it followed the rules I had learned to survive by, and yet it had happened, it was still happening, and he was the reason for all of it, and I realized then that I had never even asked for his name, that I had stepped into this entire situation without knowing the most basic thing about him, and that felt strange now, almost surreal, so I took a breath, steadying myself before speaking. I do not even know who you are, I said, my voice quieter than before but clearer, more grounded, and he looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable but not distant, just controlled, as if he had expected that question eventually, and there was a brief pause before he answered, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. Sebastian, he said, and the name settled between us, simple but heavy with something I could not define. And I repeated it in my mind without meaning to, letting it anchor to the image I had built of him, to everything he had done, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging it even if I did not fully understand what it meant yet, and then I asked the next question, the one that mattered more now than it had before. What happens next? I said, because this could not be the end of it, because nothing about this felt temporary anymore, and he held my gaze for a second longer, something shifting subtly in his eyes, not softer, not warmer, but more certain, like the answer had always been there, waiting for me to ask, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, unwavering, carrying that same quiet authority that had guided everything so far. Now, he said, you do not have to do this alone, and the words lingered in the air between us, simple on the surface but carrying a weight that pressed against everything I thought I knew, because being alone had never been a choice for me, it had been a reality, a constant, something I had learned to accept without question, and hearing him say that, hearing someone speak as if that reality could change, felt almost unreal, like stepping into a life that did not belong to me, and yet, standing there in that quiet hallway, with Noah safe behind those doors and this man in front of me who had already changed more than I thought possible, I realized something that made my breath slow, something I could not ignore anymore. This was not just about that night, this was something bigger, something that had already started reshaping everything around me, and for the first time, I did not know whether I was more afraid of what could go wrong, or of what could happen if I let myself believe him. I did not answer him right away because I did not know how to, because the idea of not being alone felt too big to accept in a single moment, and instead I just stood there, letting his words settle somewhere deep inside me where doubt and hope were already colliding, and I turned my head slightly back toward the room where Noah was resting, needing to see him again, needing to remind myself that this was real, that something had already changed whether I understood it or not. And I took a small step back toward the doorway, my body pulled in that direction without hesitation, and I felt him move beside me, not close enough to overwhelm, just enough to follow, to stay present in a way that was starting to feel intentional rather than coincidental, and when I reached the doorway again, I saw Noah exactly where I had left him, peaceful in a way I had not seen in days, his breathing even now, his small hand resting loosely against the blanket. And something inside me softened at the sight, not completely, not enough to let my guard down, but enough that the tight grip I had been holding on everything loosened just slightly, and I stepped inside quietly, careful not to disturb the calm that surrounded him, and I moved closer to the bed, reaching out again, brushing my fingers lightly against his, just to feel the connection, just to make sure he was still there, and I stayed like that for a moment, grounded by that simple contact, before I spoke again, not to Noah this time, but to the silence around me, to the reality that was beginning to form. I cannot stay here forever, I said softly, more to myself than anyone else, because I knew that eventually the night would end, that choices would have to be made beyond this moment, and I felt him step into the room behind me, his presence steady, unchanged, and when he responded, his voice was just as calm as before. You are not staying here, he said, and I turned slightly, my brow tightening in confusion, because I did not understand what that meant, because this was the only place that felt safe right now, the only place where Noah was being taken care of, and I looked at him, searching for something more, something that explained the certainty in his tone, and he met my gaze without hesitation, his expression composed, controlled, but there was something else there now, something firmer, something that felt like direction rather than suggestion. "You are staying somewhere better," he continued, and my breath caught slightly at that, because the words sounded simple but carried something heavier underneath, something that implied he had already arranged it, already decided it. And I felt that same resistance rise again, that instinct to push back, to hold on to the small sense of control I still had. "I did not ask for that," I said quietly, my voice steadier now, because I needed it to be, because I needed to remind both of us that I still had a say in what happened to my life. And for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not frustration, not anger, just a subtle change, like he was adjusting to me rather than overriding me, and there was a brief pause before he spoke again. Slower this time, more deliberate. "No," he said. "You did not," and the silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with something unspoken, something that passed between us without needing words, and I felt my chest tighten again, not from fear but from the weight of the moment, because I realized he was not forcing anything on me, he was offering it in a way that assumed I would understand why, and I looked back at Noah, at the calm that had replaced the chaos, at the steady rise and fall of his chest, and I thought about everything that had led to this moment, every closed door, every time I had been told no, every time I had been left to figure things out alone, and I felt something inside me shift again, deeper this time, something that was not ready to trust but was no longer ready to refuse, and I exhaled slowly, my shoulders lowering just slightly as I turned back to him, my voice quieter now, less guarded than before. "What kind of place?" I asked, and he held my gaze for a second, that same calm certainty settling over everything again, and when he answered, his words were simple, but they carried a promise I could not ignore, "The kind where you do not have to worry about what comes next," he said, and for the first time since this night began, I allowed myself to imagine that possibility, just for a second, just long enough to feel how different it would be, and that thought alone was enough to change everything. I did not answer him immediately because imagining a life without constant worry felt unfamiliar in a way that made it hard to breathe, like stepping into air that was too clean after years of dust, and I turned back toward Noah again, needing to anchor myself in something real, something I understood, and I moved closer to his bed, resting my hand lightly against the blanket near his arm, not touching him this time, just staying close enough to feel his presence, and I watched him for a long moment, taking in every small detail, the softness in his expression, the steadiness in his breathing, the quiet that surrounded him now, and I realized that this was the first time in a long time that I was not bracing for something to go wrong, that I was not waiting for the next problem to appear, and that realization alone made my chest tighten in a different way, because it felt fragile, like something that could disappear if I moved too quickly, and I closed my eyes for a second, letting that moment settle, letting myself feel it fully before it slipped away, and when I opened them again, I knew that whatever came next, I could not go back to the way things had been before, because I had already seen what it looked like when someone refused to let me fall, and that changed something inside me in a way I could not undo, and I turned back toward him slowly, my thoughts clearer now, not calm, not completely, but steadier than they had been before, and I studied him again, not just as the man who had stepped in tonight, but as someone who had already begun reshaping my life without asking for permission. And that thought should have scared me more than it did, but instead, it grounded me, because for the first time, the change did not feel like something happening to me, it felt like something I could choose to step into, and I took a small breath, steadying myself before speaking. "I do not understand your world," I said honestly, because that mattered, because I needed him to know that I was not walking into this blindly, and he held my gaze, his expression unchanged but attentive, like he expected nothing less. And I continued, my voice quiet but certain, "But I understand what you did tonight," and there was a brief pause after that, a space where the weight of those words settled between us, and I saw something shift in his eyes, not softer, not warmer, just a recognition. Like he understood exactly what I meant without needing me to explain further. And I glanced back at Noah one last time, taking in the calm that had replaced the chaos, and I felt that same quiet shift inside me again. Deeper this time, stronger, like something had locked into place, and when I looked back at him, my voice was steadier than it had been all night. "I will go," I said, the word simple but carrying everything I could not put into them, trust, hesitation, acceptance, all of it wrapped into that one decision. And he did not react with surprise or relief.